Good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Schulte for another episode of Where Eagles Dare. We got the name because we noticed that the eagles are on the dollar. The same one is on the Defense Department, and the same one or similar is on the symbol of the National Security Agency. And what we try to do is to integrate the financial, the cyber, and the defense elements of what is happening in the world today into financial markets. And with this in mind, I have today one of my dearest and oldest friends who I've known for more than 30 years, Brian Ganson. Brian is somebody who I've known for multiple decades. We went to graduate school together. And I'll tell you a little bit about Brian. He's a professor at Stellenbosch University in Cape Town, South Africa, and has been there for, I guess, around 12 years. He's globally renowned expert in conflict prevention and collaboration, post-Civil War in particular, and focuses on third-party roles in post-conflict world, focusing in Africa and other complex environments, including, we can talk about this a little bit as well, in Brazil. He did a lot of work in Brazil in the Amazon last year. He works with companies, some of the large multinationals. He works for currently a number of multiple governments in Africa and other continents. He works with various UN organizations, and he works for local communities, as I mentioned, also in the Amazon, as a researcher, an evaluator, consultant, professor, and a conflict mediator. He's a graduate of the Tufts Fletcher School, where he and I met, and also went on to do a degree at Harvard Law School, and took the bar in Massachusetts. Now, today we want to talk about the state of things in Africa. You know, the question that I have is, are we in a new non-aligned movement with the tech Cold War between the US and China? The old non-aligned movement was based in Bandung with Sukarno and other third world countries at the time. This new tech Cold War is one which is, has created a non-aligned movement in Beijing. And you know, the old joke when I was working at the National Security Council in the 1980s in Reagan's second administration was non-aligned with whom. And so today we're talking about who is aligned with whom in this new tech Cold War, which took on some fairly chilling detail last week with 2 aircraft carriers in the South China Sea from the US and China doing live military exercises a few miles away. So Brian, this is so great to have you, and you're such a dear old friend, and I could listen to you for a long, long time, and we've had long dinners together, I think, on about 4 continents. So first question is, can you describe China's current influence in Africa today in broad terms, and what you see with your own eyes in traveling to, I guess, something close to a dozen countries in the last couple of years in Africa?
Yeah, so I think what I see missing from a lot of the reporting is how diverse the experience is. From the African perspective, I think we're still trained by the Cold War thinking to think about the Soviet Union and the United States. That's certainly not how people are experiencing the US or China across the continent. You have the side of China which is indistinguishable from Western companies. So if you're in Uganda and you're talking to somebody from Chinese National Oil Company, or somebody from Tullow, which is North American, or from Total, which is French, indistinguishable, right? So you have this face of the modern multinational corporation in Africa, which is China. You have a lot of I would say the overwhelming majority of the Chinese investment, which is either in extractive projects or project finance supporting those extractive projects. And so that creates another face of China as another player in the extractive economy. You also have more than 1 million Chinese living in Africa, which is also often underestimated, right? By comparison, there are fewer than 200,000 US citizens estimated to be living in Africa, more than 1 million Chinese, and many of them involved in smaller enterprises, smaller businesses. You have the growing Chinese support of multilateral institutions, so Chinese support for the AU, Chinese support for UN peacekeeping forces. So the Chinese, one of the stories of China in Africa is the breadth of the experience of China, which has changed dramatically in the last 20 years.
That's fascinating. So we'll carry on with that as we go through this. Now, what's your take on the sudden rise of or the influence in China? Was it a sense of the U.S. sort of pulling back and China filling a vacuum, or can we say that the U.S. sort of gave up on Africa? What's the deal there in terms of the general direction of the U.S., broad general direction of the U.S. in Africa relative to China in the last several years?
Well, right, again, we're going to have the same conversation on the U.S. side, because U.S. investment in Africa still dwarfs Chinese investment in Africa. So certainly the private sector players have not given up on Africa in any meaningful way. The U.S. is still engaged through multilateral lending institutions, World Bank, IFC, African Development Bank, and the like, special purpose vehicles that are being set up for investments. I think at the intergovernmental level, the overwhelming sense is that the US is stuck in this space, which is not a good one for reputation, not a good one for relationship, not a good one for influence. Militarily, it's about combating Islamic State, combating Al-Qaeda. When we look at interventions where the US is supporting militaries around the continent, you see it being anti-China, right? Our Trump wannabe Secretary of State parading around telling everybody how bad China is for them, without offering an alternative, without saying, and there is a choice to do something different. So right now at the intergovernmental level, and of course our disparaging of the entire multilateral system, reduced support for UN peacekeeping, reduced support for, well, withdrawal from the World Health Organization, which certainly has a solid reputation in this part of the world. The US has retracted at a governmental level into this anti-space. We're against Al-Qaeda, we're against China, we're against Islamic space, but that leaves the question, well, what are you for? And China, I think, has done a better job with not all that many resources, right? If we actually look at what's being provided, is telling a much better story of being for Africa, pro-AU, pro-UN peace building, pro-development projects, holding now about, what is it, about 20% of sovereign debt, under a banner of being pro-development. And so I think if we reduce the conversation to the intergovernmental space, China's doing a better job telling a story right now.
That's interesting. Now, so here we are with these, characters in power in Washington now, and we don't know what's going to happen next year. But they have set in motion the defense establishment into an anti-China mode. And so my question here is, do you think that the U.S. is under the impression it can somehow dislodge China and force China to become irrelevant or take away its power in the same way that it did with the Soviet Union in the 1980s and the late 80s?
Well, the U.S. might pursue that kind of policy, might see some things that think it was succeeding in that policy, but my sense is the bigger question is, what is China's strategy for the coming decade? In this last round of Chinese political wrangling, and here I'd love to hear your point of view, because you're much closer on that side, is we're not hearing a lot about Belt and Road Initiative anymore. We're not hearing a lot about Chinese intentions in China, except at a very headline, almost now in the COVID era, it's all about relief aid. It's not clear that there is a China strategy. It's not clear that the strategy to buy African through direct investment and through project finance paid off. China invested an enormous amount of money at the top of the commodity cycle, and it's hard to see how that's going to pay off. China has always had trouble understanding that African politics are much more complicated than aligning with the elite in power, and is getting blowback in Djibouti, in Kenya, where the railroad project was declared as illegal. The contract entered into for the building of the high-speed rail in Mozambique. We can go around the continent. So I think the question isn't, can the US force China out, but what are China's opportunities and intentions right now?
Well, that's a great point. I think, though, that since January the 2nd, when COVID hit, I think that the top three priorities for China have been, COVID, COVID, COVID. And I still believe the top three priorities for China are COVID, COVID, COVID. I mean, everything else has been put on the back burner. And even when I hear discussion of the next 5-year plan coming into place the end of 2020, you hear very little about the One Belt, One Road. I think China that's a great point you make, though. I think China is retreating from the rhetoric of, the newcomer on the diving board. Hey, look at my double somersault. Watch this,
Yes.
I think that China is going to go low key on, the 2025 technology projects and the, One Belt, One Road. That was being heralded, as a new sort of a new thing to gather national, interest in such projects. I think it's going to go very quiet, and I think there has been a lot of blowback onto Xi Jinping for being so public about some of these ambitious projects. I think the ambition hasn't gone away. I think the rhetoric will. So we have to watch. We turn down the volume and watch what they're doing on sides. Now, so the next one is, you've been living in Africa for, a good part of your life now, almost 20% of your life. And so the question is, Africa is full of potential and always will be, they say. Is this potential energy, is it finally turning a corner? Is this potential energy turning into something kinetic?
I would say, I am, after my time here, much more of an Afro-optimist, perhaps, than I was before I got to know the continent. The changes are real. The growing middle class, with the political demands that brings, the ability of people to organize and have their voices heard. The trouble is one has to cherry pick data, and if one is in an optimistic mood, one can tell optimistic stories. If one is in a less optimistic mood, one can find certainly the problems. But if we look at Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, the engines of the continent, we're seeing real changes in the real economy. We are seeing real changes in the expectations of growing middle class population. We see growing urbanization, which brings a whole host of dynamics with it that are, from my perspective, largely development positive. And it's fragile. It could be undermined. But relevant to our conversation, I think people are very clear-eyed that neither China nor the US, certainly not the Europeans, are where the future is. That we are in devil's bargains with whomever comes. I mean, I think the most recent Afrobarometer was interesting. It asks always sort of what country do you see as the developmental model for Africa? What direction should we be going? And in the latest version of that, last year, I believe, it was 30% for the US and 24% for China. But what that's really telling us is half of the people on the continent are saying we don't really have a development model out there. And I think that realization that there has to be an African path is settling in. And those are the periods we've seen progress in Africa, whether it was Black consciousness and anti-colonialism, anti-apartheid, Pan-Africanism. When Africa looks more inward, that's where we see progress. People are not easily fooled by the rhetoric. I think your point of turning down the volume, look at what's really going on. All of the noise from China from 2000 to 2020, there's no evidence that increased manufacturing in Africa. Just none, right? That's not, so do people believe at any fundamental level that China cares about Africa's development? No. Clearly that's been the case for Europe as well, with some very small exceptions where manufacturing clusters have built up in South Africa, in Nigeria, a little bit more in Kenya now. Nobody is waiting, right, for somebody else to sign on to our developmental plan. And I take that for fundamentally healthy.
Yeah, that's great. So let's divert for a second on that one. So if we take the example of Huawei, there's an example where the functions, among functionalities, the apps of Huawei are giving Africans a tremendous entree into new types of payment systems, financial systems, insurance, ways to hold money without getting robbed. What's the deal with Huawei, and is there U.S. influence to stop African countries from using Huawei?
Well, right. Remember that mobile money, the solutions that are being, we are much more likely to be. I think if you went into the streets in Cape Town, you couldn't find somebody who knew what Huawei was, right? If you said, what do you think of M-Pesa, the Kenyan solution, they would be excited. So again, the people are not sitting around. People have been finding solutions to these problems of banking. It's interesting, the largest bank, if you can call it that, in Uganda right now is a cellular phone company. People are afraid to hold their money in the formal banking system because it makes you a target of corruption and predation. So you hold your money as mobile phone credits, right? People find solutions. M-Pesa was a solution for Kenya, and it's being expanded and mimicked across the continent. There are robust technology sectors in South Africa, in Kenya, increasingly in Nigeria as well. And yes, they're probably using some of these backbones, but that's not how they're being branded. That's not how they're being brought to market.
No, fascinating. I was talking to some British military people last week, and they were saying that they are noticing some noisy activity between China and the US, sort of in the netherworld of clandestine activity in Mozambique and Angola. Is there any other things that are on your mind about things you hear from the grapevine on what's happening?
Well, you have, I mean, again, we have to talk about the multiplicity of Americas and the multiplicity of China's. As we have growing citizen demands in Africa and growing insecurity across a variety of dimensions, I think the big story is around the security tied to the private investment. So in China, in Mozambique, if you look at the American private security presence across the continent, tied very closely to our oil and gas and other extractive interests. Same thing in Angola, same thing in Guinea. I think the hot Cold War that we are experiencing with Russia, for example, in North Africa, where the proxy wars are re-emerging, the point scoring. I'm not aware of that. I'm not in a position to say it's not happening, but that is not high. But what you see is a lot of self-protection by actors who have put these tens of billions of dollars into the ground, and now realize in Mozambique, in Kenya, elsewhere, the blowback is coming.
Yeah, and they need to do, both sides need to do the kind of political and paramilitary, action in order to protect these extractive locations and assets with governments and on location.
Absolutely, and I don't think anybody is doubting that it's happening. I think the other concern, again, in which China are we talking about, is there seem to be in parts of West Africa in particular increasingly well-organized illegal mining operations, so large-scale criminal gangs, if we can call them that are using Chinese equipment, that are certainly have to be finding their export markets in ways that at least having people questioning whether there must be ties to Chinese military and Chinese military-owned companies. Again, I'm not in a very good position to assess the underlying truth, but when you see large-scale illegal mining, meaning bringing in tens of millions of dollars of heavy equipment, the ability to divert streams and rivers, large-scale processing, one assumes there's a lot of corruption, and one assumes there has to be a pretty deep pocket behind it.
What kind of general industries are we talking about? Aluminum, gold, nickel?
Right. It has to be what we would call the superficial minerals. So in West Africa, that will be gold and diamonds, the old stories.
Got it. That's fascinating. Okay, so what are the 2 or 3 hotspots in Africa today that people are not paying attention to?
I don't think that there is an understanding of the extent of the disruption. The last reliable figure I saw said there are probably more than 1 million displaced people in Burkina Faso alone. So if we look at that, area of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, there is an incredible degree of chaos, of lack of effective government control over the territory, of adventurism, as we know from the occasional report that pops up in the US press if US troops are killed. But I don't see very much attention to that at all. I would put that as the number one underreported spot. I think the depth of the crises in places like Mozambique, where there really is no longer a governing consensus, are probably misunderstood as well. It's not a few rebels off in the bush trying to seize a few trucks worth of petrol. Same thing perhaps in Nigeria. The depth of the crisis, it tends to be written off by the government in power because it has to keep a good face. It has to be written off by the international allies who are supporting them. So the way Nigeria talks about the crisis, both in the north, but also in Biafra, in the Niger Delta, the way Mozambique talks about the crisis in the north, I think belies the depth of the loss of faith in the current system.
Yeah, fascinating. And a couple of countries that you see great hope that people are not paying attention to.
It's hard for me to sit here and know. I mean, you know, what's always fun is if you look at the, as you said, I love that image of turning down the volume and looking at the looking at the what's actually happening. I mean, if we look at the countries, the top 5 recipients of FDI in Africa: Egypt, South Africa, Congo, Morocco, Ethiopia. Take Congo out of that, that's probably all resource driven. You know, markets for all their faults actually know where things are hanging together. These are places, Ethiopia, South Africa, Egypt, that have growing middle classes, that have the capacity to develop manufacturing. So the economy is not simply extractive, are growing players in the service sector. So actually, you know, on the plus side, I would say when we'd have to add Nigeria, just because although it's an enormously complicated place, within that complexity, there are also bubbles of wonderful things happening, and in particular on the domestic front, domestic players serving domestic and regional markets. You see, you know, South Africa is now the squarely in the top 10 investors in Africa, right? Which is not the story that one is used to of Africa investing in Africa.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. And last question: where are we in the COVID phenomenon in Africa in terms of poverty, hunger, conflict? You know, sort of at the moment and longer term.
Well, I think you have 2 things going on right now. One, we started out late. We got the crisis. You talk January, we talk March. So we are now hitting peak COVID, particularly here in South Africa, highly stressed health systems that every country seemed to have gone through that. Oh, we think we missed it. Where our infections aren't so bad, our deaths aren't so bad. But as you go up the curve, you see that no place is immune to this virus, and we're definitely experiencing that now. At the same time, it is showing all the cracks and faults. In South Africa, for example, just the number of people who were living on the edge and are now facing real hunger in Sierra Leone, Liberia, where there is apparently no increase in confidence in public authorities or the public health systems since Ebola. Liberia, people breaking into hospitals and quote unquote liberating the patients, right? No belief that the government is acting in the citizens' interest in many parts. And long term, what will that mean? I think it's another huge setback. The contractions are substantial and they're real, and even any imaginable growth is going to be off of a much lower base, holding back a lot of developments. I think the crisis of governance is going to create a lot of noise and a lot of disruption. We're going to have a lot of political entrepreneurs stepping into that space. It's going to be very easy to criticize those in power now, but it's going to take a longer amount of time before a clear vision for a positive future emerges. So I think what we're going to see is in the medium term, the ability to further attack the current system, point out its flaws, point out its shortcomings, but a longer period of time before there is some gelling around a positive vision. So what? So where do we go if that's true?
That's fascinating, Brian. Brian, I could talk to you all day long, and we miss each other, and you're such a good friend, and nobody can travel. And so we're going to have to live on Zoom here for the time being. So look, stay safe, and we will talk to you soon. And once again, this is another episode of Where Eagles Dare, and that was with Brian Ganson of Stellenbosch University. Excellent source on Africa, one of my best sources, and one of the most thoughtful people I know. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Have a good day.